I remember that day so vividly. The day everything started to change, though I didn't realize it at the time. My wife, Jessica, and I were just wandering through the mall, enjoying a quiet Saturday together. We weren't even shopping for anything specific, just soaking in the atmosphere and people watching. Jessica had always been someone who thrived in social settings, even casual places like this, where people were just bustling about with their own lives. As we turned a corner into the main atrium, I felt her suddenly pull away from me. At first, I thought she saw something she wanted to check out, but when I looked over, I saw her face light up in a way that made my stomach twist just slightly, a bright, surprised smile that I hadn't seen in years. Following her gaze, I saw him. He was a tall, dark-haired guy in his mid-30s, looking every bit the part of someone who's aged gracefully. He wasn't a stranger to me, though. No, this was someone Jessica had mentioned in stories before, a high school classmate named Matt. She'd spoken about him a few times, always with a tone of nostalgia, but I'd never seen them together, never seen the kind of spark that now danced across her face. It was like she was 17 again, swept back to a time when everything was simpler. "Matt," she exclaimed, practically glowing as she walked toward him. I followed, trying to be polite, though something in the back of my mind told me this was the start of something dangerous. "Jess, wow, I can't believe it's you," he replied, his voice deep and warm, and he reached out to give her a hug that lingered a bit too long. I stood there awkwardly, watching as they reminisced about their high school days, laughing about inside jokes and people I'd never met. I felt like a third wheel, like I was intruding on something that didn't belong to me. But I pushed down the feeling, chalking it up to paranoia. After all, Jessica was my wife, and we'd been happy, mostly. The three of us talked for a while, but every moment felt like a silent competition. I was the stranger in my own relationship, while she and Matt seemed to pick up right where they'd left off a decade ago. After a bit, Jessica invited him to join us for a coffee at the food court. I forced a smile and agreed, trying to be the supportive husband, though every part of me wanted to walk away. As we sat down, Matt and Jessica continued chatting about their high school days. They talked about mutual friends, teachers, parties, and memories that seemed to flood back with a nostalgic glow. I found myself staring at my coffee cup, stirring it aimlessly, feeling a sense of displacement that I couldn't shake. Jessica seemed to forget I was even there. Her laughter filled the air as she relived stories that, to her, felt like yesterday, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever made her laugh like that. Then, something strange happened. Matt leaned in, his eyes glinting with a mix of confidence and mischief, and said, "Remember that night we snuck out and climbed up the old water tower? We could see the whole town from up there, and we promised each other we'd never lose touch." He chuckled, his tone light, but there was something beneath it, a hint of something more. Jessica blushed, glancing over at me as if she suddenly remembered I was still sitting right beside her. "Oh gosh, yeah. That was something," she mumbled, laughing awkwardly and running her fingers through her hair. Matt didn't take his eyes off her, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air. It was subtle, just a small spark, but one that struck me deep in a place I couldn't explain. I'd never felt insecure in our marriage before, but watching the two of them, I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt since we were first dating, a jealousy, raw and unfamiliar. Eventually, we all wrapped up our coffee, and Jessica invited Matt to join us for dinner sometime. He agreed without hesitation, shooting her a smile that left a bitter taste in my mouth. We said our goodbyes, and he disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with a sense of unease that clung to me like a dark cloud. As Jessica and I walked back to the car, she was quiet. Her face was still flushed, and she had a faraway look in her eyes. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I didn't want to come off as paranoid. After all, what harm could there be in running into an old friend? But that was just the beginning. After that encounter, Jessica seemed different. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle changes that would be easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed. It was the way she'd check her phone more often, the quick, hidden smiles she'd flash at the screen. Little things, like suddenly changing her workout schedule or spending extra time getting ready in the morning. One night, a couple of weeks after we ran into Matt, she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd met him for lunch. She told me they'd just caught up, talked about old memories, nothing more. But the way she mentioned it, the overly nonchalant tone, and the way she avoided eye contact told me there was more beneath the surface. I wanted to ask why she hadn't told me beforehand, or why she hadn't even invited me to join them, but I held back. I didn't want to sound possessive or paranoid. Days passed, and I tried to shake the feeling that something was slipping away from me. Jessica was still there, still laughing, still sleeping beside me at night, but there was a new distance in her eyes. She'd sit on the couch, lost in her thoughts or scrolling through her phone, and when I'd ask what she was doing, she'd just say, "Nothing," and put it away. Then, one Saturday morning, I decided to clear my head and go for a run. As I laced up my sneakers, I heard her talking in the kitchen. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but her voice carried, and I could hear her laughing softly. She was on the phone, and I could have sworn I heard her say, "Yeah, let's do it. Sounds like fun." My stomach twisted with an instinctive jealousy that was growing harder to control. When I returned from my run, she was still in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, a small smile playing on her lips. I casually asked who she was talking to, trying to sound as offhand as possible. She looked up at me with that same distant smile and replied, "Just a friend." "A friend?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded. "Yeah, Matt. He just texted to say hi." I bit back the questions I wanted to ask, the kind of questions that make you sound suspicious and secure. I wanted to know why she seemed so invested in his every word, why her eyes sparkled every time his name came up, why she'd laugh so freely when they chatted. I wanted to believe it was harmless, just nostalgia, just two old friends reconnecting. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move on from it. I reminded myself that Jessica and I had been together for years, that we had a strong foundation, but the signs were impossible to ignore. She started going out more often, sometimes coming home late and brushing it off with vague explanations about catching up or losing track of time. There was one night she came home after midnight, her hair slightly disheveled, her face flushed. I asked where she'd been, and she hesitated, just for a split second, before giving me that casual smile and saying, "Just out with friends." A part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But another part of me was scared. Scared of what I'd find if I pushed too hard, scared of confirming the suspicions that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Instead, I just nodded, pretending to accept her answer, though the bitterness was starting to eat away at me. The next day, I decided to do something I'd never done in all the years we'd been together. I checked her phone. She'd left it charging on the counter, and I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, my heart pounding as I debated whether to cross that line. My rational mind told me not to, that this was an invasion of her privacy, that trust was the foundation of any relationship. But my instinct screamed at me to open it, to look for the truth. My fingers trembled as I unlocked her phone, navigating to her messages. There it was, a conversation with Matt, recent and ongoing. I skimmed through the messages, feeling my stomach tighten with each line. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing," one message read. My throat went dry as I kept scrolling, each text more intimate, more flirtatious than the last. "I'll be thinking about you," she'd written, along with a winking emoji. And then, the message that shattered any doubt I'd been clinging to, "Let's meet at the same place tomorrow. I miss you already." I stood there, gripping the phone, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath me. There was no mistaking it now. Jessica was seeing him, going behind my back to spend time with him, hiding it from me with every lie and half-truth. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I put the phone down and walked to our bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I needed space, needed to clear my head. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, but instead, I sat there, numb, staring at the wall. I didn't know how to process it, didn't know if I should stay or go, fight or let go. As I sat there, my mind replaying every moment we'd spent together, I heard the front door open. Jessica walked in, calling out, "Hey, I'm home." I didn't respond. The weight of what I just discovered was too heavy, the betrayal too raw. But that was just the beginning. Little did I know that the truth was even darker than I could have imagined. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every memory of Jessica replaying in my mind, but now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. Every laugh, every intimate moment, every "I love you" felt hollow, a lie woven into the fabric of our relationship. My mind raced, trying to piece together every sign I'd ignored, every excuse I'd accepted. And all of it pointed back to that encounter at the mall, to Matt. The next morning, I got up before her, my head heavy and my heart hollow. She was still asleep, looking peaceful, like she didn't have a single worry in the world. I wanted to shake her awake, to ask her how she could lie to my face and still sleep so soundly beside me. But I held back, choosing instead to keep my suspicions to myself. For now, I went to work that day with a numb sort of anger simmering beneath the surface. I couldn't focus, couldn't hold a single thought without it leading back to her. Every smile, every text, every moment we'd shared felt like a cruel joke. But as the day wore on, I realized I needed proof, something concrete. Without it, I knew she'd just deny everything, paint me as paranoid, tell me I was imagining things. So I decided to gather evidence. That evening, I pretended to be normal, even managed to laugh at her jokes, though every part of me ached with resentment. When she casually mentioned she'd be meeting a friend later in the week, I nodded, acting as if I believed her. But inside, I was already planning to follow her. If she was lying again, I was going to catch her in the act. The night of her meet-up arrived, and she left around 7, dressed a bit more carefully than usual, her hair done up in a way she hadn't bothered with in a long time. I forced a smile and wished her a good time, my heart hammering as I watched her walk out the door. I gave it 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and following her, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I navigated through the familiar streets. She parked her car at a quiet spot on the far side of town, near an upscale bar I knew she'd never mentioned before. I waited in the shadows, watching as she stepped out of the car, glanced around nervously, and checked her phone. Moments later, Matt pulled up in his car. He got out, and the two of them shared a brief, intimate hug that made my blood run cold. They exchanged a few words, smiling at each other, and then they disappeared into the bar together. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling a rage and helplessness I'd never known before. There they were, right in front of me, laughing, smiling, enjoying each other's company like I didn't even exist. My mind screamed with questions. How long had this been going on? What had I done wrong? Why wasn't I enough for her? After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront her, to tear this entire lie apart and force her to face the reality of what she'd done. But as I reached for my door handle, a voice in my head stopped me. Was that really the answer? Charging in, accusing her, throwing our life into chaos in a single night? A darker, calmer part of me told me to wait, to gather more evidence. If I acted now, she'd just talk her way out of it, make me doubt myself. But if I was patient, I could expose the whole thing, every lie she'd told, every betrayal she'd committed. I'd leave her with no way to escape the truth. With a heavy heart, I let go of the door handle and sank back into my seat. My gaze locked on the bar's entrance as I watched them, waiting for them to come out. Nearly 2 hours passed before they finally emerged, looking relaxed, their bodies close as they walked to their cars. She hugged him goodbye, laughing softly at something he said, before finally getting into her car and driving off. I followed her home, keeping a safe distance, and slipped into the house just minutes after she did. She was in the kitchen, casually pouring herself a glass of wine, as if she'd just come home from a harmless night out with friends. I felt a rush of bitterness at her ease, the way she could act so normal after lying to my face. "How was your night?" I asked, forcing my tone to sound casual. She looked up, a little startled but quickly recovering, smiling at me in that easy, unbothered way she'd perfected. "Oh, it was great. Just caught up with some friends. Nothing too exciting." She shrugged, sipping her wine like it was any other night. I nodded, biting back every angry word I wanted to hurl at her. "That's good. Glad you had fun." I managed a small smile, though inside, I felt like I was falling apart. But I knew I had to play along, had to pretend that everything was fine. If I let her think I was onto her, she'd just become more careful, make it even harder for me to catch her in the act. No, I needed to bide my time, to gather every piece of evidence I could. Over the next few weeks, I became the perfect husband, or at least, I tried to appear that way. I was attentive, affectionate, doing everything I could to make her believe I was oblivious. But every time she left for one of her nights out, I'd follow, watching as she met Matt, laughing and smiling as if she didn't have a care in the world. I documented everything, took photos, saved texts, even managed to record a few conversations she had with him when she thought I wasn't around. The more evidence I gathered, the more my anger grew, but I held it in, knowing that my patience would pay off. But just when I thought I'd seen it all, things took a dark, unexpected turn. One night, I followed her to a different part of town, to a dimly lit, out-of-the-way bar I'd never seen before. She met Matt there, as usual, but this time they were joined by a third person, a man I'd never seen before. He was older, rough around the edges, with a smug grin that made my skin crawl. Jessica and Matt greeted him like an old friend, and the three of them disappeared inside. I waited in my car, my heart racing as I tried to piece together what was happening. They'd never met with anyone else before, at least not that I'd seen. After an hour, they finally emerged, laughing and looking far too comfortable. Jessica looked different that night, almost wild, like she was stepping into a part of herself I'd never known. As I watched her laugh and joke with this stranger, a horrible realization started to take shape. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else, something darker, more twisted than I could have ever imagined. And I knew then that whatever secrets she was keeping, they went far deeper than I'd realized. I sat in my car that night, the engine running quietly as I watched Jessica, Matt, and the stranger drive off together into the dark. The realization that Jessica was tangled up in something I couldn't understand gnawed at me, making the betrayal feel deeper, more complex than I had anticipated. I'd prepared myself to confront her about the affair, to tear down the lies between us. But now, I was staring at a much darker secret, one I couldn't grasp but that I knew would lead us into a place far beyond infidelity. I followed them, staying a few cars back. They wound through town, finally heading toward the outskirts, where old industrial buildings lay empty and forgotten. My heart raced as I tried to guess what she could be doing in a place like this, with Matt and this unfamiliar man. Finally, they pulled into the gravel lot of a deserted warehouse, its cracked windows and rusted metal sides looming in the moonlight like something out of a nightmare. I parked a safe distance away and killed my engine, my breath catching as I watched them get out of the car. They didn't head for the building immediately. Instead, they lingered outside, talking in hushed voices, the stranger handing something to Matt, a briefcase. I squinted, trying to make out what was happening, and saw the stranger pass them each a small black bag. Jessica took hers without a word, glancing around nervously before shoving it into her purse. This wasn't just an affair. Whatever was going on was something serious, something dangerous. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, fighting the urge to storm over and demand answers. But as much as I wanted to confront her, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. If Jessica was involved in something illegal, something potentially dangerous, rushing in without knowing the full story could end badly, for both of us. I stayed hidden, waiting until they finally went inside. With every minute that passed, the weight of betrayal and confusion grew heavier, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I needed to know what was going on, needed to know who that man was, what he had given them, and more than anything, I needed to know why Jessica had let herself be pulled into something so dark, so completely separate from the life we'd built together. An hour went by, then two. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. I wondered if she was in over her head, or if this had all been a part of her life for far longer than I'd ever known. Finally, they emerged, looking tense and alert. Jessica glanced around as they walked toward the car, and I instinctively ducked down, my heart pounding. They climbed in, and I watched as they pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the road. I sat there for a long time after they left, staring at the empty warehouse, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I knew then that confronting her wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just between us. This was something bigger, and if I acted on emotion, I could end up tangled in whatever she was involved in. No, I needed to be smart, to find out exactly what I was up against. I needed a plan. Over the next few days, I pored over every piece of evidence I'd collected. The texts, the pictures, the recordings. I started looking into Matt, scouring social media, digging up every detail I could find about his life. I wanted to know what he'd been up to, where he worked, who his friends were. But the more I looked, the more questions I found. He had no clear job, no stable address, and his social media was a mess of vague, flashy posts that didn't seem to add up. I couldn't find a single trace of the life Jessica seemed to believe he had. Finally, after a week of silence, she told me she'd be meeting her friends again. I tried to act indifferent, pretending to be busy with my own plans, but inside, I was ready. I had a hidden camera set up in her car, my phone primed to record every word she'd say. That night, as she left, I followed her once more, my heart pounding as she met Matt and the stranger outside the same warehouse. But this time, I caught something new. As she stepped out of the car, she handed the stranger an envelope. He opened it, looked over the contents, and nodded, handing her a small slip of paper in return. She glanced at it briefly, her face pale in the glow of the streetlight, before stuffing it into her purse. My stomach twisted as I watched, feeling more like a stranger in her life than her husband. Jessica wasn't just sneaking around with Matt. She was hiding a world of secrets, each one darker than the last. I watched as they disappeared into the warehouse once again, this time recording everything on my phone. After they'd gone inside, I stepped out of my car and moved closer, my heart hammering with fear and anger. I crept to a side window, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on. Inside, I could see a group of people gathered in a circle, low voices murmuring, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoing softly. Jessica and Matt were seated in the middle, looking oddly out of place in the crowd. It was a kind of gathering I'd never imagined Jessica attending, dark, private, with an air of secrecy that made my skin crawl. I snapped a few photos, taking care to stay hidden. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a burst of laughter and a familiar voice echoing through the warehouse. Jessica. She sounded different, unrestrained, wild, like she'd shed every layer of the woman I thought I knew. I slipped back to my car, feeling a chill settle over me as I drove home, my mind racing with every image I'd seen, every moment of betrayal I'd just witnessed. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else, a world she kept hidden from me, one she'd willingly chosen over our life together. That night, as I lay in bed, waiting for her to come home, I knew I was at a crossroads. Confronting her would force the truth out, but it might also shatter whatever hope there was of salvaging our marriage. But if I kept quiet, if I continued down this path, I could gather the final pieces of evidence I needed. And when I was ready, I could destroy this secret life she'd built, take away every lie she'd wrapped herself in. When she finally walked through the door in the early hours of the morning, I pretended to be asleep, listening as she crept quietly to the bathroom. She was different, wilder, more alive than I'd ever seen her. And as I lay there, listening to the sounds of her moving through the house, I knew I was no longer looking at my wife. The woman who'd once been my partner, my confidant, was gone. In her place was a stranger who was hiding secrets that I was determined to uncover. But what I didn't know was that those secrets would lead me down a path I could never return from, a path that would force me to confront the darkest parts of myself and ultimately to take a revenge I'd never thought myself capable of. After that night, everything shifted. I was no longer the clueless husband, desperately trying to save a crumbling marriage. No, I had a purpose now, a dark, burning need to expose every lie Jessica had woven around us and to make her feel every ounce of the betrayal she'd inflicted on me. I spent the next week gathering every bit of evidence I could, no longer content with simply observing. If she thought she could keep this life hidden, I'd show her just how deeply I could dig. My first step was visiting a private investigator. I laid out the entire situation, showing him the photos and recordings I'd taken, along with the messages I'd saved from her phone. He listened quietly, nodding as he made notes, his expression grim. "If she's involved with anything illegal, we'll find out," he assured me. His words gave me a twisted sense of relief. Finally, I was doing something. I wasn't just waiting for her to slip up. I was taking control. A few days later, the investigator called me with news. Jessica and Matt weren't just having an affair. They were tangled up in something far darker. Apparently, Matt had been involved in various scams, swindling people out of their money with promises of investments that never materialized. And it seemed Jessica had joined him, willingly or otherwise, funneling money into accounts and covering their tracks. I was numb as he explained it all. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted, had chosen to walk down this dark path with another man, betraying not just me, but every part of the life we'd built together. But rather than confront her outright, I decided to keep my composure and see how far she was willing to take this. If she thought she could play me for a fool, I was ready to show her just how wrong she was. The final straw came one night when she came home later than usual, her face flushed and her eyes bright with a reckless energy. She didn't notice me standing in the hallway, watching as she pulled out a handful of cash and stuffed it into a drawer in our bedroom. I waited until she'd gone to the shower, then went to the drawer, pulling out the cash and examining it. It wasn't just a few bills, it was thousands, all in crisp $100 notes. And tucked between the bills was a slip of paper with Matt's handwriting scrawled on it. "Meet me Thursday. Usual spot." My blood boiled. This was it. She'd chosen her side, and now I was ready to destroy every illusion she'd built. I didn't want a simple confrontation, a shouting match where she'd deny everything. No, I wanted her world to crumble in the same way mine had. On Thursday, I prepared everything. I'd taken a few extra days off work, calling in sick to make sure I'd have all the time I needed. I started by moving our savings into an account she couldn't access, setting aside enough to cover any legal fees. Then, I gathered every piece of evidence I'd collected, the messages, the photos, the recordings, and uploaded them to a secure folder, one I planned to use as the final nail in the coffin. That evening, as Jessica prepared to leave, I sat on the couch, watching her. She was dressed in a way she hadn't for me in years, her hair perfect, her makeup carefully done. As she walked to the door, I felt a pang of bitterness, wondering if she even remembered the man she'd once promised her life to. But I pushed the feeling aside. Soon, she'd understand exactly what she'd thrown away. I waited until she was gone, then grabbed my phone and made my way to the warehouse. This time, I wouldn't stay hidden. No, I was going to confront her in a way that would shatter any illusion of secrecy she thought she still had. When I arrived, I saw her car parked out front, along with Matt's and a few others I didn't recognize. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the cracked windows. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say. But as I stepped inside, I froze. The scene before me was worse than anything I'd imagined. Jessica and Matt were seated together, surrounded by a small group of people, each of them laughing and talking in low voices. Jessica had a drink in her hand, leaning against Matt, her expression carefree, almost euphoric. They were sharing an intimacy, a bond, that she hadn't shared with me in years. But what caught my attention most was the table before them. It was covered in documents, stacks of cash, and what looked like a few passports, as if they were planning something far beyond a simple fling. They weren't just hiding an affair. They were planning an escape, a whole new life, funded by the money they'd stolen. And Jessica, my wife, was a willing participant in every moment of it. I felt a cold, steady rage settle over me. They thought they were untouchable, that they could just walk away, leaving everything and everyone they'd betrayed behind. But they had no idea I was there, watching them unravel, their perfect little secret about to implode. I stepped forward, clearing my throat, and they turned, their faces draining of color as they saw me standing there. Jessica's drink slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor, her eyes wide with horror. "Surprised to see me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger boiling beneath the surface. Matt shot to his feet, his face twisting in anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" he spat, his bravado slipping as he realized I wasn't leaving without answers. "I'm here to watch the truth come out," I replied, pulling out my phone and hitting play. The recordings I'd made, the whispered plans, the stolen kisses, the lies, echoed through the room, each word a knife cutting through the illusion they'd so carefully crafted. Jessica stumbled back, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. But there was nothing she could say. I'd seen everything, heard everything, and now she had nowhere left to hide. "Did you really think you could just walk away?" I asked, my voice cold. "That you could betray me, lie to me, steal from me, and there'd be no consequences?" She stammered, "It's not what you think. I can explain." But I shook my head, silencing her. "You had your chance. You made your choice." I turned to Matt, my glare icy. "And you? This is your life now? Hiding in the shadows, stealing from others, dragging people down with you?" He didn't respond, his face twisted in fury, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the table. Inside were copies of every piece of evidence I'd collected, along with a letter addressed to the police. "I've already sent everything to the authorities," I said, watching as Jessica's face crumpled in horror. "By tomorrow morning, they'll know everything." Jessica sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I felt a pang of something, pity, maybe, but it was quickly swallowed by the satisfaction of knowing she'd finally faced the consequences of her choices. I left them there, their world crumbling, the reality of their actions crashing down around them. As I walked out of the warehouse, I felt a strange sense of peace. The woman I'd once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. But now, I was free. Free of the lies, the betrayal, and the weight of a love that had been poisoned beyond repair. The next day, the police arrived at our house. They questioned Jessica, who could barely meet my gaze, her face hollow, her expression defeated. She was arrested later that afternoon, the full weight of her crimes catching up to her at last. As I watched her being led away, I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. She destroyed our life, shattered every promise, and now she'd face the consequences alone. And as for me, I walked away, finally free, knowing that sometimes the only way to heal from betrayal is to let the truth tear down everything and start anew.